Race is a belief system, it's a social construction. Anthropology has challenged the idea of scientific racism. But just because I can get up here and your textbook can teach you about the social construction of race does not mean that we have solved all the problems in society. Because really, what we actually have out there is what they call structural racism. So even if race isn't biologically real, that is to say, it's based on an illusion about how people are sorted into these biological categories. Again, not that people aren't different from each other, we are, but we're just not very well sorted into these race categories. Experiencing the effects of racism directly affects biology. So, although race is not biologically real, when we experience or the effects of racism are actually become biological. So I give you a couple examples of this, such as racism in the hospital. Pretty serious. In the United States, Black women are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth than others, and their babies are 50% more likely to be born prematurely and more than twice as likely to die in the first year of life. Yeah, so actually this figure is the product of an anthropologist who was challenging some of these ideas of obstetric racism. And I would say that those statistics seem depressing, and they are depressing, but they don't have to be that way. There are counties and places in the United States where people are able to make adjustments and come up with different kinds of outcomes. So this is not a biological given, but it is something that happens within this setting. They talk about then also racism and embodied stress. And this is not something that is genetically transmitted. Again, people are different in all kinds of ways, but it speaks to overall person's lifetime. If you are in this situation, you can have increased hypertension. They give the example of telomere shortening and basically accelerated aging. Now, again, these statistics are sometimes depressing. We should be motivated to think about how our systems could be different. It does not have to be this way. There are ways in which we can address these issues, but this is something, again, that racism does have a biological aspect to it. Now, in the next section, they talk about the persistence of racialized societies. So although many of the social structures that we encounter were built 100, 200 years ago, 70 years ago in history, and although we know that biologically speaking, race shouldn't exist, we never have, we still live in racialized societies. So they talk about racism as an ideology. We've talked about race as a belief system. Racism becomes an ideology that people belong to these categories. And so they talk to us about what they call racialization, how we all participate and are taught to put people into categories. So by racialization, they mean that you look out over the world and you learn from a very early age how to categorize people into whatever types or categories that you have. And then through the advantages that come through institutions, you want to maintain advantages that certain people have in that system. And so, although people may know better in some ways, we nevertheless have the persistence of racialization in our own and other societies. One of the interesting ideas they talk about here is that this racialization often comes through something they call colorism, valuing those who are closer to whiteness, you might say. And that can be skin color, but it can also be different features, it can be just proximity to the dominant group in society. And on the one hand, we see this, perhaps we do see this in our own society, although people tend to downplay it, but we actually see it in different places around the world. The stuff to lighten their skin, and they give you an example. This was actually, they were trying to draw attention to the toxicity of some of these things by staging it. This is in the Philippines to warn people about this, but you can see how even in a society like the Philippines, you have this idea that you should get your skin closer to whiteness. So some people are surprised by this because it's not only in societies that have these very racialized differences, it can occur in many different societies where people want to get closer to the top. So many different, the Philippines is an example, other Asian countries and large parts of Latin America, there's this idea of the skin gradation. And it also is an interesting phenomenon because it can occur within groups that are marginalized. So even within, let us say, an African American community, there's a prioritization of the people who have lighter skin, and that's magnified or that's valued within that society or within the Latino community, that there can be this prioritization or value based on proximity to whiteness. A lot of, how to say, people in the United States, a lot of white people, I do colorism too, but we don't actually always realize it. And so there's been an interesting study done. For example, if you take two people and you say, well, this person has committed a crime, people are more likely to harshly penalize the person who has a darker color skin tone. Let's say that they're both would be classified as black in our society. If they're darker skin tone, they're more likely to say, oh yeah, that's worse, should be accorded a higher crime. And in this study, the author says that the disparities in policing and punishment within the Black population along the color continuum are often comparable to or even exceed disparities between Black and whites as a whole, which is wild if you think about it. What the author is saying is that there's a greater disparity in treatment within the darker, we might call darker skinned Black versus lighter skinned Black, than there is sometimes between the categories of white and Black. And so this is something that is actually present in our own society. We don't always acknowledge it or think about it, but it is something that shows up in different places. Sometimes it is expressed in something like this pretty popular meme that you see, where the police officer is stopping this person and it's just saying, well, we got from okay to not okay there. And in this case, we see what we would call the color line in the United States. But colorism would say that there are varying degrees of not okay and maybe varying degrees of okay all the way up and down the line. This meme has been super used all over the place and mocked in different ways. I like this one. So they're saying there, of course, is that the difference between protesters and people who are rioting is going to be based on the same gradation. If you see people of color doing this, it's like, you got to get those rioters off the streets. Whereas if it's these people, it's a protest. Your book then talks about various ways in which we learn to racialize, or we learn how to put people into categories and to continue the system in which we have or perpetuate the system of racialization. One way is the census, and in our own society, every citizen and every person in this country is asked to differentiate themselves in terms of race and to declare something on that in the census. They talk about, as we just said, in terms of policing, and this has been how people learn how to categorize and how to distribute benefits and punishment in policing, in schooling. So even those people like me who are trying to be all progressive and inclusive, we nevertheless sometimes end up reinforcing some of these racial categories. Of course, they talk about everyday interactions, how people learn what group they belong to. They talk, for example, about how people from China who come here don't necessarily think of themselves as Asian Americans. They think of themselves as part of a Chinese group, but they learn how the American racial system works and then start to align themselves accordingly. Used a term. It's a big word. It's a hard word to even say in the sense that it sounds extreme. But a lot of times the practices that we learn build upon and reinforce what they call white supremacy. I want to spell that out for you, what they're talking about when they say white supremacy. A political, economic, and cultural system in which those who are identified as white overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some rich people of color and some people who have power within that society, but most of the power is within the white population. Again, it also doesn't mean all the white people are rich either. But if we look at our own society statistically, this is certainly still overwhelmingly true, in which conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority are widespread. Different ideas about intelligence, about ability, about whether you're in a protest or a riot, whether you're good or bad, all those things. Racism is daily reenacted, police stops, schooling, and systematic oppression of non-white people is justified. So when I was looking for those memes of colorism, I found all kinds of other memes, which was basically justifying the incarceration or the treatment of non-white people. Almost nobody wanted to talk about any of these things. They're hard to talk about, and in some ways, this is even a little bit out there for anthropology textbooks. I would say that 10 years ago, I never saw the term white supremacy in a textbook of anthropology. We talked about structural racism, of course. I've been talking about that forever. But the term white supremacy would have been seen as too out there, too radical. And so with the events of 2020, the murder of George Floyd and other events, the term white supremacy has been something that anthropologists and others have been more willing to say and hear and acknowledge. So even more people on the news talk about it. And so here it is in our textbook, but it's rather incredible for anthropology. And I've assigned this textbook for next semester as well, so I'll be happy to do that again. But really, the next time I teach this course, when I teach white supremacy, I'm going to get reported. And then there's going to be like, no, you can't teach that, man. That's too much critical race theory. That'll be it. So it's been nice, folks. It's been a good time, but this is it. We've seen each other this semester, but we'll never see each other again. All right, so just copy that down, keep it in your books. It'll be disappearing down the memory hole soon.